Thank you very much, Brother Holland. It's a joy to me to be with you folks, and I commend the good work you're doing. And when I speak on this in lectures, I always wonder, should we have an invitation when I get through? Kind of an awkward situation, calling on the brethren to respond. Who would if he needed to, because he might think he was getting branded for the wrong reason, So I've always wondered, how do you close this kind of a lesson? Let's just stop, and then we'll have the invitation next after we do that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 through 11, the Apostle Paul said, "Or know ye not, that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with men," and both of those describe homosexuals, "nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. But you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and the Spirit of our God." First century church confronted the problem of homosexualism. They did not conclude that it was an acceptable alternate lifestyle. They did not conclude that they were just unfortunate, misunderstood people that we should open our arms of fellowship to. They did not conclude that really they should be ordained to the ministry and given an area of service in the kingdom, but rather Paul saw it as a kind of unfortunate sinners who needed to repent, to be washed, sanctified, and justified, and make that past tense in their life, as this verse suggests. Now, an all-wise Creator made us like He knew we ought to be, and He gave each of us a distinctive sexual nature, and He assigned the unique role in life to men and women. True happiness only comes when women recognize and accept their femininity, and when men recognize and accept their masculinity. And moral disaster always comes to those whose minds are confused and bewildered about the sexual identity, and those who choose this lifestyle that they call gay, but in reality is one of great pain and sorrow, great disaster, as they walk in the face of the winds of life, and as they attempt to engage in a way of life that can only bring God's displeasure and great moral consequences upon them. They're not a happy people. They're among the most miserable, unhappy people in all the world. Well, for the benefit of those of you who might be a little older, I think we ought to define our subject. I find some older people that aren't quite sure what we mean by all of this. Homosexuality means eroticism, or sexual desire for one of the same sex, which results in sexual conduct with the same. I like to point out that because a person might have had one such experience in life does not necessarily brand him as a homosexual. I say that because it's not really uncommon for little children to have some type of sexual experience with someone of his own sex as he's growing up. But most people outgrow that. They quickly realize that's not right, it's wrong. And they abandon such thoughts and ideas and go on to a normal heterosexual life, that is, a male-female type of relationship. But rather we're talking about people who have chosen this as a style of living, people who have chosen this as an ongoing way of conduct. In the book of Romans chapter 1, Paul dealt with a problem that was so prevalent in first century society. Beginning at verse 26, "For this cause God gave them up," that is the Gentiles, "gave them up unto vile passions, for the women changed the natural use of that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working unseemliness, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was due." Now, it was a problem that affected both men and women then, and so it affects both men and women now. Men we usually refer to with such a terminology as queers or faggots and such. They're people who are homosexuals. They choose to love males rather than women. Women usually referred to as lesbians. And of course there are women who have chosen to love a woman rather than a male for their companion in life. The problem is much more extensive than most of us have been aware of. Remember when I was a boy, we had a few people like this around town. I can think of 3 or 4 that I knew of in the city of Nashville, heard guys talk about. I'm sure there were more, but they didn't run up a flag and advertise themselves. They didn't have their clubs that met openly. They weren't meeting at some denominational church and having church services. They weren't able to function openly and above board because the community would not have tolerated it. that would likely have been run out of the community. But as it is now, they can march 125,000 down the streets of San Francisco and have a riot, and the city officials try to be nice to them and not really pinch them too hard. They can run for public office and announce themselves as being, representing the homosexual community and get elected in some communities. It's interesting that just a short while ago in 1964, it was established by those who were concerned with security in the nation's capital. There were at least 4,000 homosexuals in Washington. I imagine that's only a small fraction of the number at this particular time. Over a 5-year period, over 400 were dismissed from the State Department alone because of security reasons. It's estimated today that 6 to 10 of every 100 people in America are homosexual, practicing homosexuals. I saw on TV just this last week where they're making the claim now that 10% of America's population is homosexual. In his book about homosexuality, Jess Stern, the book called The Sixth Man, said, one day we'll be the majority and you'll be the minority, and then we'll be the normal ones and you'll be the abnormal ones. And you wonder if it was a vain boast that he was making, to see how this thing has changed so drastically just in the last 10 or 15 years. And you see people like governors making way for these people, granting them public assignments to high office, because after all they recognize that they represent a block of voters, and they're organized now and militant. The president appointed Gene O'Leary, president of the Gay Task Force, to a prominent place in the International Year of the Woman just a few months back. So he recognized these people as a voting bloc, and he wanted to offer some concession to them so he could court their election, their support in his coming elections. Now the Bible has got a lot to say about the question of homosexuality. In the book of Genesis in chapter 19, we have that famous and classic story about the angels of God that went to visit Sodom. And of course, when they arrived, we realized that the good man Lot was concerned about their welfare. They were going to sleep on the street that night, if necessary, until morning came. And so he insisted that they come into his house. But we read at verse 4 that the men of Sodom compassed the house around, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And that indicates how extensive the problem was. They called unto Lot and said to him, where are the men that came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us that we may know them. The word know here doesn't mean we can shake a hand, get acquainted with them, but it means the same thing as when we read that Adam knew his wife and she conceived and brought forth a son. The most intimate of knowledge, sexual knowledge. And of course, Lot pleaded with him not to do this evil thing that they wished to do. And he was willing even to sacrifice his own daughters for the sake of his guest. And we read, too, that God utterly destroyed that civilization from off the face of the earth, burned them up with unquenchable fire because of the great evil that they had been guilty of. Some have wondered and speculated if maybe the sin that Canaan, the son of Noah, committed was this sin. Maybe you've noticed this passage in Genesis chapter 9 at verse 20. Noah began to be the husbandman, planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent, that is, naked. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah woke out of his wine and knew what his youngest son had done unto him. And he said, cursed be Canaan. Now, maybe all of us who have aged relatives have had to give them a bath or change their clothes or change their bedding. And we didn't feel like we sinned because we saw Grandpa's physical body and his nakedness. And no curse was upon us. But something happened that day that was done. And when Noah realized what had been done, so grave and severe was the problem that he said, cursed be Canaan for what had taken place. Then again, other passages that perhaps would reflect on this will be noticed. But I remind you that homosexuality is not a new phenomenon. It's one of the ancient sins of mankind. For example, ancient Greece and Rome were just riddled through and permeated with the sin of homosexuality. If you study history carefully, you'll find that great men of history like Alexander the Great was bisexual, loving both men and women. The Caesars, virtually all of them, homosexual, including Julius Caesar. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato, openly practiced their homosexuality. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Frederick the Great, just a few of the names of history. But it flows on down. But I remind you that those civilizations crumbled and fell. They were destroyed because of the moral degeneracy that set in upon them at this time. Another interesting thing about homosexuality is that it's the curse of affluent, advanced civilizations. You don't have it when a civilization is in its formative period, when people work hard for a living, when there's not much time for leisure, when there's clear-cut distinctions between the male and female roles. It was interesting when I was in Nigeria in 1966, we were preaching out in the countryside, very primitive situation. One of the young preachers asked us as we were riding along one day, he said, well, just what does this passage mean in Romans 1? He'd been to Bible school, but in his mind he couldn't grasp women with women working unseemliness, that which was against nature and such. And so we tried to explain, and he looked with a rather blank stare on his face. He said, we don't have a word for such as that in our vocabulary. See? And it's true that among the more primitive races of people, where people have a very hard, grueling existence, where the sex roles are clearly defined, it's almost unheard of. And it was almost unheard of in this country when it was like that. But the more advanced we become socially, the more affluent, the more weakened we get as far as the masculine role, the more confusion there is between the role of men and women, then the greater is the problem of homosexuality. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse because there has been a planned and programmed and a very articulately worded and a worked effort to destroy these distinctions. The feminist movement would destroy the distinctions in male and female. The unisex movement has pervaded the clothing industry and the styling industry for now 20 years. And so it's sometimes difficult to look and tell the difference in a man and a woman's dress style, hairstyles, and such. Why? Because they've been told, well, you know, you don't need to be different. But we've learned that always in the train of such as that comes along such problems as homosexuality. Well, what does God's Word say about it? Well, we read in Genesis that God looked upon that situation in Sodom and He utterly destroyed them. It's interesting that when we debated the homosexuals there in Knoxville, they said, oh, they were just lacking in hospitality. They weren't guilty of any sin. God didn't punish them because they loved men rather than women. But look at the book of Genesis chapter 13, verse 13. The men of Sodom were wicked, sinners against Jehovah exceedingly. And then Jude says in verse 7 a little bit more about what these people were doing. He doesn't mention the hospitality factor, but he does say even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, having in like manner given themselves over to fornication. We know what that is, and gone after strange flesh. Are set forth as an example, suffering the punishment of eternal fire. It wasn't a matter of hospitality. You have to read that into the Bible. There's no mention such as that at all. But it was a matter that they were perverted sexually. And God judged them because of it. From Sodom has come our word sodomy, which is frequently in the legal codes of nearly every city, county, and state. And it speaks of these sexual crimes against people that involve something other than heterosexual relationships. It's amazing to see how the denominational churches have almost run over each other, getting in line to lend justification and approval to homosexuality. A distinguished panel of Church of England theologians were commissioned to study this question 7 or 8 years ago. They could not even arrive at whether or not it was sin, much less how bad a sin it was. Now, evidently they didn't consult the Bible. The Methodist Church, unable to come to terms with it, decided. The American Episcopal Church, unable to really come to terms. It was impressive to me that they finally did decide that they couldn't ordain them as clergymen, though they could accept them as members. Well, now, if you can be a good brother and standing, why in the world couldn't you preach? I can't see there's that much difference in it. United Church of Christ, which, thank God, is no kin to us, has officially accepted and endorsed and condoned homosexuality as an acceptable alternate lifestyle. The tragedy is, your children may well be taught this in public school, and if Planned Parenthood in your community is able to get into the schools with their sex education program, they will definitely teach them that really there's nothing wrong with this. These people aren't funny or queer or weirdos. They're people just doing their own thing, and everybody has to do his own, make his own decision. And furthermore, I saw a very interesting document just this last Saturday, a non-published document of Planned Parenthood that says one of their tools to help cut down our population growth would be to encourage homosexuality. They don't have babies. But like Anita Bryant said, since they don't have babies, they have to look to our babies if they want some additional recruits. And that's where the real rub comes in, is it not? We must realize that our children will definitely stand in great jeopardy as this thing grows. In the book of Leviticus, under the law of Moses, God had this word to say to the children of Israel. At verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, sexually he speaks of. It is abomination. In the next verse, thou shalt not lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Bestiality is in the same category as homosexuality. And if we're going to have to give way to the homosexuals who say, make us legal, make us respectable, then when some fella comes up and he's got his little community that wants to be able to publicly and socially in an acceptable way have a sexual relationship with their pet dog or donkey or cow, then you see we're going to have to grant them the same privileges, are we not? After all, we wouldn't want to be guilty of discrimination on race or sex, would we? And that's the logic that has been driven to the extreme of absolute stupidity in our country to gain recognition for these people. From the highest levels on down, our president has met with delegations of these people. And yet someone will come along. They have a pedophile society in England now. Sex with children. They want to have the permission as adults to be able to legally engage in sexual activity with little children, and there should be no laws restricting it. After all, children have the same sexual rights as adults, they're saying. Where do you stop such as this? And what about the necrophiliacs, those who like to make love with dead bodies? Are we going to be able to give them recognition too? They're all of the same abominable category. Now I want you to notice what God said about this situation. Verse 24, defile not ye yourselves in any of these things. For in all these things the nations are defiled, which I cast out from before you. And the land is defiled, and therefore do I visit the land thereof, and the iniquity upon it, and the land vomiteth out her inhabitants. Why did God displace the Canaanite nations? Why did he take their land away and give it to the Hebrews? Was it just because they had a different religion? No, that's only a small part of it. Was it just because he'd promised Abraham some land? That was a rather small part of it. He could not give Abraham's descendants that land when they weren't that bad. You remember they had to wait 400 years. But after 400 years, they had filled the cup of moral iniquity and depravity. And God said the land vomits them out as some rotten, spoiled thing in their stomach. And then across the page, if you'll notice, he warns the children of Israel that they must take heed, lest they do the abominations that the men of the land had done that were before them, and the land vomit them out also. And I suggest to you that this premise is as true today as it was when Moses wrote it then. If we as a people stand back and do nothing and allow this land to be defiled by such ungodly immoralities as we're speaking of, and many others that are prevalent in our society, I am convinced as I stand here that God will cause our land to vomit out an unworthy generation of people, and he will give the land of people who are more worthy than we. It might even be someone like Russians or Chinese. He gave the land of the Hebrews to the Babylonians for 70 years. He did it. And I don't imagine the Russians, Chinese are any worse than they are, and yet God, in his estimate, saw them as more qualified to control the land than his own people were. He had to purge his people and rid them of the horrid sins that they were guilty of. Well, there are just numerous verses in the law. In the prophets you find a similar type of a thing. In the book of 2 Kings, at chapter 23, verse 7, and here's what happens when God's people refuse to take a strong stand against this. We read that when Josiah began his illustrious reformation, that he brake down the houses of the Sodomites. Thank God for Josiah that he took a strong stand against sodomy. But they were located in the house of Jehovah. Can you believe it? Well, you had the Metropolitan Community Church meeting right there in Jerusalem. Set up shop in one of the annexes there in the temple. Just like in the Unitarian Church up in Knoxville, they let the Metropolitan Homosexual Church meet in their meeting house and endorse them and wrote up commendation of them in the newspaper. But that's what the United Church of Christ is doing, and what the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church is doing. And if we don't stand and speak out and educate and take the position that we ought to, I can suggest to you that there might be some time in the distant future where somebody will have to rise up and drive them out of the Lord's church. Because you're foolish if you think that there won't be somebody that will come along and say, I want to be a member, and you have no right to oppress me because of my sexual preference, or who want to preach. And if we're as weak and as compromising and as watered down on that as we've allowed ourselves to be in some other areas, we'll find ourselves unable really to take a strong stand against it. You know, you can use the same logic on dealing with that as you can with an arrogant woman, or as you can with a little faction in a church. After all, we can't afford to lose all these people. You don't want the community to know we've got problems, you know. Well, these are fine, substantial people, and their daddy was here, one of the founding charter members, and they give a lot. Use the same logic on one as the other. It's unscriptural, it's wrong, we must stand. Well, the New Covenant speaks to it. The passage in Romans, not only did Paul say that they were great sinners when he listed what they were doing, men with men working unseemliness, but he says in verse 32, who knowing the ordinance of God that they that practice such things are worthy of death. Now that's how God views it. In God's sight it is a crime worthy of capital punishment, but not only do they do the same, but consent with them that practice them. Those United Church of Christ ministers who approved homosexuality are worthy of death in God's sight. Why? They endorsed homosexuality. And those Episcopal bishops who could not find grounds on which to condemn it stand worthy of death with them. Why? Because they could not find a basis on which to oppose such a moral abomination as the Lord speaks of. In that 1 Corinthians passage, chapter 6, verse 9 through 11, you were effeminate and abusers of yourself with men, but he says, now you're washed, you're sanctified, you're justified. Well, let's talk a few minutes now on what causes perversion. And we leave the Bible text and we have to look then into some other areas. We hear people say, well, one's born that way, but not at all. Dr. Charles Socrates, who is an MD, says that homosexuality is not innate or inborn, but is an acquired or a learned process. And he said that in the Journal of American Medicine. The Sex Information and Education Council of America, SECUS, one of the most abominable and morally degenerate organizations in the country, says, quote, that genetic, constitutional, or glandular factors play little role in the causation of homosexuality. That's Dr. Isidore Rubin, Ph.D., great champion for sex education in America, himself a hedonist, obviously one who is against everything God stands for, but he says, no, you don't inherit it. It's not something you're born with. Homosexuality is something that is chosen. These people admit, and most of them are proud of the fact, I made a choice, and I'm proud of my choice, and you should respect my choice. Homosexuality is what we call psychogenic in origin, that it begins in early life in the family. I want you to listen now to a quote or two that we have. Dr. Maurice Fishbein, in his book Successful Marriage, says that though genetic and hormonal factors may contribute to causing homosexuality, the environment which leads to homosexuality would still have to be provided. In other words, he explains, the training is the differential in the individual's ultimate behavior. It's the way you raise that child that has much to do with what his choice is. And listen to this quote from Peter and Barbara Wyden in their book, Growing Up Straight. This much is certain, they say, it is just about impossible for a homosexual to be the product of warmly loving, sensible parents and a sexually well-adjusted home atmosphere. It always comes out of that kind of environment that the child is growing up in. Well, if you'd like to get some good information, I suggest that you consult a book that I found very helpful. It's called A Psychology of Counseling by Dr. Clyde M. Naramore. Now, here are some suggestions that he has on causes that contribute to the homosexual conduct of people. And I've picked up another one or two thoughts from other sources. Number one, he says, it may stem from lack of wholesome sex education. You know, you would think of all things that we would recognize that a child needs to know something about his body and his bodily functions. And yet, for some reason down through the years, we've tried to hide that from him. And we parents just felt like it'd be better not to mention it, and maybe we could somehow, divert his question. But the kid still has the question, and he still wonders why I'm made like I am and what makes me function like I do. So he seeks out information. And since he can't get it from a good, reliable source like mama or daddy, or from some of us who are Christians, he often ends up getting it on a street corner, or behind the barn, or in the school locker room. And it often is from the very terrible sources of the world. But 2, faulty childhood impressions and unwise handling by parents have profound effects on the child, sometimes causing sex problems in later life. For example, little kids always like to play doctor and like to play nurse. And if you deal with a little child's doing such as that as by teaching him that it's nasty, that it's evil, that somehow it's horrible for him to be interested in such as that, you may temporarily block him from doing it, but he grows up thinking that if he's interested in that little girl, then that's ugly, and that's dirty, and that's vile, and that's terrible. And as he gets older, he has a hard time feeling that it's right for him to be interested in a member of the opposite sex. And yet he has a powerful sexual drive, and he finds it fulfilled in people of the same sex, which he was not warned about, you see. Number 3, sex problems may be created and or aggravated by the elements of a secular society. Listen, movies, books, magazine, TV, which portrays homosexual love as normal, tender, and exciting. Now, if you watch what's going on, and I don't go see these things, but I like to read the reviews, and I try to read them in the Sunday paper every week in our Knoxville paper, it would amaze you how many movies now are based on homosexual themes. How many television shows. The Lou Grant show the other night, he was this nice, decent policeman who was being harassed and persecuted. His only thing was he was a gay person, and he didn't hurt anybody. He was the hero of the show. He even died for his cause. Now look who the rascals are. It's all of us who are against homosexuality. And who's the hero? It's a nice, clean-cut, nice-looking, manly, properly behaved homosexual. He's the nice guy. All the rest of us are rascals. Now, Dr. Lawrence J. Hatter of Cornell said in a paper delivered before the American Academy of Psychoanalysis that homosexuality can be triggered by environmental influences, chief of which are suggestive homosexual literature, plays, and movies. Now, it's bad for kids to see these people out on the streets, but at least we can keep that out of our home. But when it comes flowing into your den or your living room by television, and they have these shows portrayed as something tender and loving and kind, and really it's beautiful, then you see the child's defenses are eroded, and he gets confused as to just what is or is not acceptable. When it happens that he has a school teacher that's like this, and there's a role model before his eyes, it's confusing to him. Why do people say he's bad? He's such a nice guy. A scoutmaster, see? That's why we feel that these people must be kept out of those sensitive roles in the training of children. If he happens to be given some homosexual literature, now pornography is a problem, and it's bad. But added to that now that much pornography focuses on and promotes homosexuality. That's really the big thing in pornography these days. And so the little child maybe slips and sees this, and he gets thinking, well, that's the way everybody does it. I didn't know that. And then when the homosexual approaches him to seduce him, his defenses are gone. When the older boys try to abuse him and he doesn't know any better, he says, well, maybe that's the way it is, you see. Now, the 5th thing, the thoughtless mother who wanted a little girl but got a boy, so she treats her son as a girl, dressing him in frilly clothes, keeping his hair long, encouraging him to play with girls' toys. He grows up thinking it's natural for him to fill a feminine role. And you see a lot of that. You see that in the church sometimes. I remember cases I have known where people treat that little boy like a little girl, or vice versa. They wanted a boy, so they named their girl, Tommy or Billy, and they cut her hair off like a little boy's, and they put her in jeans, and she doesn't have any dresses. A family just recently, their little daughter didn't have, as far as I could tell, a single dress to wear. Now, after a little teaching and help, she's got her pretty little dress. And I always make a point when I see them, they're new, to comment on how pretty she looks and how nice that dress looks. She's a sweet little lady. Maybe I can help her. But the parents had been affected by the secular society in which we live in. The unisex thing had its way, you see. Listen to this one. A weak father. The son cannot look to his father for moral support in his struggle to be a man. A daughter can lose respect for men in general because of a weak father. Little boys learn how to be men, not by reading books about it, not by going to lectures, by observing a man in action at home. Daddy doesn't do his hair like Mama's. Daddy dresses different than Mama. Daddy shaves every day. Daddy goes out and works. Daddy does the hard jobs. Daddy takes care of getting the grass and washing the car and things like that. Mama takes care of home. Mama takes care of the babies. Daddy takes care of discipline when we get in trouble. And he learns as he grows up. That's how I ought to be. You take a boy who grows up with a weak father, who does not fulfill the masculine role, or who's not at home enough to be a role model to his child, or who has abandoned the family, who is a moral reprobate, and he refuses to do any of those things. He does the opposite of them. Well, then what kind of examples does a little boy have? The same way about little girls. They learn how to be feminine by watching mamas in action. Had you ever realized, mothers, that your little child is watching you thinking, I'm going to do like mama? And I find myself after 41 years sometimes responding to a problem, and I'm not pleased with the way I responded. And then as I sit back and analyze myself, and I try to look at life daily, I say, you acted just like your old daddy did, not even a Christian. Unconscious reflex. You see, you just do it because that's what you observed growing up. Now, I want my children to see a man in the home fulfilling the manly role. I want them to see my wife fulfilling the feminine role. And they will grow up to be able to make that distinction in their life. Listen to this, an overindulgent mother. She spoils her son. She may unconsciously try to make him a substitute husband. This is especially where there's no father at the home. Sometimes his emotional attachment to his mother is so strong that he feels guilty about loving another woman. And so his sex drive forces him to men rather than to women. Let your boys be men, ladies. Don't try to make a husband out of a little boy. He's your son. You're his mama. And he needs to recognize the difference in that thing. And then the cruel father. The father's so cruel that the son fears him and all other men. He can't compete with men. And so to get along, he finds himself attracted to the women. Not sexually, but as a woman. You see, he becomes identified as feminine. Yet he desperately needs acceptance with boys. To win this, he can't be it as a peer because he's lost his masculinity. He wins it by allowing his peers to abuse him sexually in order to get their attention and their favor and their friendship. Girls with cruel fathers may transfer their fear and hate to all men in general and turn to loving a woman instead of a male. Girls who turn to lesbianism are often the victims of a lack of love in the home. Isn't that interesting? And isn't it kind of scary when you think about it? Listen to this one. Initial sex experiences. Children are often seduced and molested by homosexuals. Don't believe it. Don't be so naive and so ignorant as to think that if these people can function as scout leaders, if they can function as school educators, if they can work in camps, and we would have no way to restrict or regulate who we brought in terms of moral conduct. You must be dense indeed if you think they will not solicit and seduce your children and mine. Now, if one lived in the world very long before he's a Christian, he knows that these guys and women, they prowl the streets of the cities looking for young people who are naive, who don't know that they can seduce and that they can involve in their conduct. And not only will they do that, they'll enslave them in it if they can. It's not at all uncommon to find young people. I had a boy in Nashville, you may have seen this in the paper, had spent 2 years in involuntary servitude to a homosexual man. The man threatened to expose him. The boy's daddy had threatened, he'd beat the daylights out of him if he ever caught him. And so the man intimidated him, used him. He'd bribed him with money and candy. He'd been using him all this while. And he was really, a kinky sort of a fella. And then, spiritual influences. Romans chapter 1, verse 24 through 27, when people refuse to have God in their knowledge, it's not at all strange that they would abandon every kind of moral restraint. When people refused to have God, when they were filled with vain knowledge and vain wisdom, when their senseless heart was darkened, then they degenerated into this kind of moral conduct. And in a godless secular society, evil men always wax worse and worse. They don't get better and better. God will give them up, and the end result will be such perversion as we're talking about. Now, I don't know how you view the situation, but frankly, I used to laugh about this. I thought that they didn't know what they're talking about. I am convinced that Francis Schaeffer is correct when he says we are living in a post-Christian society. Now, we as Christians, we're still holding on tight ourselves. We view the Lord as Master. We honor His Bible. Our little enclave of Christianity now is very much Christian. But Schaeffer talks about the United States of America. Government, education, media, philosophy, business, ethics, social standards. He said, long since has the influence of Christianity been abandoned. The restraints of Christianity have been abandoned. And the average man in the world is not influenced in any appreciable degree by the Scriptures, by the ethics of the Scriptures. And so it's no wonder that we see this 125,000 marching down the streets of San Francisco. What is there to restrain them? What is there to stop them? A little handful of Christians trying to function in that great metropolitan center. What influence are we having on the world? Now, the only hope is the gospel, preached, proclaimed, lived. When the gospel is now at such a low ebb in our society, and when the church is kind of retrenching and pulling in and abandoning its outpost, then we're in no position to really fight this thing. And listen now to these last two. Homosexuals recruit heterosexuals into their fellowship and practice. Nearly every boy who's been out and running around like most teenage boys do for a while, if you're not a Christian, will have been approached by homosexuals somewhere down the line. You find them in school. I remember in high school. Here was a guy working as a volunteer helper to the coach. He was out there driving the boys here and there, take them out for steaks after the game. Only later, when I got out of school and after I was already preaching, did I find out why that he has had such an entree with the men, the boys. He was a homosexual. And that's what his job was, you know. Now, the coach may have not been smart enough to figure it out, but the boys all knew it. He kept them supplied with money and with steak dinners and beer and the whole run of things, you see. Such practices, and this last one is potent, as unisex hairstyles and unisex dress styles tend to bring about confusion as to sex roles. You can understand why God said to Moses in Deuteronomy 22:5, let not a woman put on that which pertaineth to a man, neither that which, let not a man put on that which pertaineth to a woman. Now the reason why that he was discouraging them dressing alike was the fact that it encourages a loss of sexual identity and a confusion of sexual conduct. And today that same principle is true. Mamas, teach your girls the beauty of fixing their hair up pretty and of being feminine, being ladylike. Teach them the joy of a pretty dress. And teach them how to be attractive as women. Teach them their role as women. Teach them that they ought to look forward to being a wife and a mother as the greatest accomplishment in life. And they want to be able to keep their home in a beautiful fashion. And that there is something especially beautiful about a gentle woman, feminine woman. And teach those little boys that it's great to get out and work hard, and they want those muscles. And not to be ashamed to wear their hair like a man and not in a halfway shag like the girls. And teach them that there's something respectable about working and making your own way in life. And there's a certain pride in a man helping a woman across the street or opening a door or helping her carry the packages. And a man doing those heavier jobs. And a man meeting the obstacles of life and the challenges and the difficulties, protecting his wife and children so that your little children can grow up knowing where they ought to be. Now, I mentioned to you about the pedophile society. Don't think that it won't happen. We usually, as Brother Warren mentioned, about 20 to 25 years behind Europe and England. Tom O'Carroll, chairman of the Pedophile Information Exchange in England, professor now at the Buckinghamshire Open University, has filed for recognition for his group. And he says, we don't support what we believe to be dangerous to children. And he just wants children to have the same sexual rights as adults do, and especially so that his radical group of homosexuals can have lots of play toys. Now that thing is the kind of stuff that's going on in our world, and we as Christians live in that world. Well, someone says, can homosexuality be prevented? Absolutely. Now, I would be the first to concede that probably once a person has been addicted to this lifestyle, it's one of the most difficult things to break them out of. The rate of those who are able to break with it and live a straight life on is extremely small, but it's not to say that it cannot be. First of all, to be prevented, I like this statement from Dr. Irvin Beaver, an MD, paper on homosexuality, a study of male homosexuals. We have come to the conclusion that a constructive, supportive, warmly loving father precludes the possibility of a homosexual son. He acts as a neutralizing, protective agent should the mother make seductive or close binding attempts. Did you men hear that? A warmly supportive, loving father available to that boy growing up precludes the possibility, in this doctor's opinion, of having a homosexual son. God give us the strength to make the value choices we have to make. Job is important. My son's future welfare is more important. Preachers, preaching is important. But our children just demand a reasonable amount of our time. What more tragic thing than a great man of God who's helped to forge, and shape the destiny of the world by his preaching, and all of his children end up lost, morally, spiritually. And that's happened so many times we could not tabulate it, I'm sure. Take time for your children. And it's not enough just to say, well, I'm home. What do you do with them when you're home? Do you spend the time necessary? And do you take the time, especially when they're little? You know that a child's moral values are mainly set by the time he's 5 years of age. 80% of what he thinks about life has already been decided, the basic fundamental principles of life. And if he's learned that men don't have to stay at home with their families much, you don't have to fulfill the family duties, that's the way he thinks. If he's learned that men can be weak, and that men can be manipulated, and that women are equal to men in every way, and that men are equal to women in every way, he'll think like that. Is there any hope for those who are caught in it? I think so, and our text says it. Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with men, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. They can't go to heaven, by the way, church or no church. And such were some of you, he said, but you were washed when they were baptized, sanctified when they were set apart to the service of God, justified, treated just as if they'd never sinned, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. God can save a homosexual. God can reform their life. But God expects we who are Christians to fight the battle, to help keep people from getting into that condition, and to help the world to realize how the Creator of mankind views this abominable sin. May God give us the courage and the conviction to fight the good fight of faith.